In this video, we're looking at groups and how people behave in groups. So far in this course, we've looked at individual attributes and behavior. But when people get together in groups, sometimes the whole is larger than the sum of its parts. How does group behavior differ from individual behavior? What are the basic qualities of a group? And how do groups make decisions? That's what we'll address in this video. First, a group is kind of like a living, breathing thing. It goes through a life cycle, if you will. There's a model of 5 stages of group development: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning, for groups that disband at the end of their usefulness. In each of these stages, a group displays different qualities, and people within the group might play different roles. It's important to remember that individuals oftentimes take on roles in groups that maybe are not their typical personality. I've given a few examples of group roles here. Those of you who've worked on teams before might be familiar with some of these. There's the role of the devil's advocate, the person who's always asking questions or challenging assumptions. There's the cheerleader, who's focused on making sure everyone's getting along and celebrating individual achievement within the group. There's the organizer. This is the person who's always scheduling meetings. And these are just a few of examples of roles. You might brainstorm and think about the type of role you typically play in a group and how that might vary from circumstance to circumstance and why that might vary from circumstance to circumstance. Groups are defined by a number of different attributes. First are group norms, which are the accepted standards of behavior in the group. These vary quite a bit. For example, I was on the tennis team when I was in high school, and there it was an accepted norm. We oftentimes made fun of one another. We'd pat each other on the back. There was a lot of physical contact. That's normal for a sports team, but if I were to do that, for example, at a meeting with my colleagues at the university's School of Management, it might be considered odd because that's not an accepted norm. They're the status of members. So some groups are groups of your peers. In this class, you'll form a team of peers. But oftentimes in the workplace, you'll be working in a team where people have uneven levels of power or responsibility within an organization, and how you behave in a group when your boss is part of that group might be different than how you behave in a group where everyone is your peer or your subordinate. Then there's the size of group. So the ideal size of group varies quite a bit depending on the type of task the group is performing. For idea generation, you typically want a larger group. For a very thorough performance on a specific task, you probably want a smaller group. In larger groups, you can encounter the phenomena of social loafing. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. You've probably been on a team in the past where one member didn't contribute as much as other members. Interestingly enough, this is something that typically happens in North American and Western European cultures and is not a phenomenon you see as much in, for example, Asian societies. Cohesiveness. Essentially, how much does your team or group enjoy being together? You'll find that cohesive teams can perform well together, although there are some challenges with teams that are very cohesive that we'll talk about in a second. Diversity. Is everyone on your team of the same opinion? Do they hold the same values? There's also, of course, surface level diversity, which are characteristics like race or gender or age. So diversity can kind of oppose cohesiveness, at least at the beginning. And in the short term, a diverse group can be more challenging to manage, but in the long term, there are substantial benefits to diversity. Having different opinions can improve the general quality of work. Having some conflict in a group is actually quite healthy. I mentioned there are some downsides to having a cohesive group. One of those is a cohesive group is more likely to engage in groupthink. That's when the group emphasizes consensus over accuracy. You may have experienced this in a group in the past where you had one idea going into the meeting, but after the meeting you realized you weren't in the majority, and slowly you were convinced that the group's opinion was correct. While consensus is not always a bad thing, sometimes it doesn't lead to ideal outcomes, or it causes people who would otherwise dissent to quiet their opinions and not raise points that probably should be considered when making a decision. We talked in Chapter 6 at some length about individual decision-making processes. It's important to note that group decision-making varies a bit from the way individuals make decisions. Group decision-making can be much slower than individual decision-making, but it can also lead to a more complete assessment, especially in a diverse group where people have distinct points of view. You can have a better, more thorough outcome through a group decision-making process. Lastly, I'd like to leave you with some words of wisdom from a Google study about what makes a good team. All of you are about to begin a group project for this course. So Google spent years studying what made the best work team, and what they found is that while many different work styles seem to work well for different teams, in a good team, members all spoke in roughly the same proportion. That doesn't mean that everyone spoke the same amount in every single meeting, but generally speaking, everyone contributed in an equal way. Second, good teams all had high average social sensitivity. In other words, they were good at intuiting how others felt based on the tone of their voice, their expressions, and other nonverbal cues, and they paid attention to this. You might think of this as having a high EQ. As you set out to work in teams over the next couple of weeks, consider these qualities and how you might apply them to your own work.